so many people, as you say, don't feel as if there is anything much to, it's the dead white men objection that we're so familiar with. I mean, I'll say to my shame that it took me a long time actually to get over the progressive assumption that is instilled in our education systems of all places nowadays, that there is something suspect about old things, rather than the exact opposite, which is that if an idea, if a text has persisted for a very long time, that says something in its favor.
Yeah.
It seems that we have that exactly backwards, right?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think some of this is understandable in that we're facing, in many ways, unprecedented challenges. We're dealing with technology that I think represents as radical and seismic a shift as the printing press did. I mean, I think we're at that level, that kind of 500-year level of transformation. And so many things are emerging that either we've never seen before or that take a form we've never seen before. So we'll have arguments about like what is truth, for example, which is a very, very old question, but they'll take place in the context of artificial intelligence and fake imagery and stuff that can just be confected with increasing clarity and precision out of nothing. And one of the things that I try to do in my book, and through the process of writing the book, I think one of the things I learned about myself and about why I love old books is that by looking at how these problems have presented themselves in the past, you can start to kind of grasp at what about them is essential and what about them kind of strikes at the core of our humanity, which has two, to me, really salutary effects. One is it creates this wonderful feeling of knowing you're not alone, that these issues are actually perennial, that the questions they raise are, have been shared by other people, have been wrestled over by other people. G.K. Chesterton says that the fellowship of men is even more moving when it reaches across centuries than when it reaches across nations. And I just find that a really touching thought. But then the other thing that this kind of communion does is it allows you to get to the heart of some of these things and understand sort of what's driving a lot of the craze over, post-truth politics. The book deals with transgender stuff. All of these kind of issues that seem really daunting and disorienting. Yeah, it's actually a point in a book's favor if those sort of things have been dealt with 100, 200, 300 years ago, rather than 5 minutes ago on CNN, which is, I think our impulse to turn to that is very understandable when everything seems so new, but it's actually probably the opposite of the direction we should be going in.
I want to talk about some of the ways in which we are similar to ancient thinkers. The fact, I agree. The human nature is basically not changed for a very long time, and to assume that it has is a very dangerous political mistake, right? But can we also talk about some of the ways in which the ancients were different from us in some of their central assumptions? My husband always likes to joke that, the idea of calling Aristotle white, for instance, it's just like
Absolutely.
right. Like he would. From the get-go, the fact that we're not Greek would be an enormous, enormous count. It would really count against us, right? In his vision of things.
Right, the fact that we're speaking this barbarian tongue would be the
right.
Yeah.
What are the some of the central things that you think a reader of these texts needs to understand about the different ways actually in which, let's say, Athenians viewed the world? Like what are some of the priors that they had that we just do not have?
That's a terrific question. The black and white one is a really great example of, I think this may be the fault of us Americans. You can tell me if you think I'm wrong, but because our central racial trauma, and it is a real historical trauma, takes place across this divide between black people and white people, the invention of black people, which is in large part kind of a product of the 19th century, gets retconned backward into every moment of history, and then all conflicts are kind of understood in terms of it or analogized to it. I mean, this doesn't just happen chronologically, it happens, with Israel and Palestinians. It's, which one of these groups is sort of more like black people in the American South and which one is sort of more like white people is like the implicit question that's being asked again and again. So that sort of thinking makes it very difficult to do what you always have to do, as you say, when you're approaching a kind of distant time frame, which is try as hard as you can to kind of lay aside the frameworks that you use to look at the world and see what's the same and what's different. So this is one, the kind of racial divide. It's not that there weren't prejudices in the ancient world, but as you indicate, they would have taken place along very different kind of lines. I mean, another example of this is sex, which we are used to thinking of in terms of these kind of immutable orientations. And that too, sort of a product of the 19th century, whether we, endorse it or not, sexual orientation is not a concept that's particularly useful for thinking about, what's going on the battlefield in Rome. I would say, power and dominance is a much more useful way of thinking about the accusation against Caesar, for example, that he was a husband to women and a wife to men. That kind of thinking is even reflected in the Greek language. The words erastes and eromenos are two masculine words that are just the active and the passive form of the same verb, essentially. And so, that's a kind of radical shift that has all sorts of implications also for thinking about male and female, manhood and womanhood. And there's even differences there between the, sort of Jerusalem side of the Western tradition, the Hebrew texts, and the Greek and Roman texts. And then the other one that I think is really difficult for us to wrap our head around is about the sanctity of human life and even the universality of humanness. I don't know if you're familiar at all with Tom Holland, but he wrote a book a few years back, Dominion, uh, in which he described his own realization that as a classicist, as a student of ancient history, he couldn't actually recognize himself in, for example, the Spartan practice of throwing babies off of cliffs, because there was just a fundamental assumption about, who deserves to live, essentially, in there. And it's easy to take this and start shading it over into evil, nasty ancient people. They kill babies, nice, good Enlightenment children. Like, we love everybody. That's not the case at all. But what it does enable us to do, I think, is notice points in the ancient world, places like, the Stoa of the Hellenistic era, or of course the biblical tradition, where this notion of universal humanity, mankind in the image of God, as the Hebrew Bible puts it, starts to emerge, because it actually is emerging against the governing assumption, in contradistinction to what most people think, which I think is a very humbling and even, in some sense, kind of frightening realization that is missing from a lot of our debates about, well, who was good and bad in the past, which has become obviously a major flashpoint. You know, there's a kind of assumption that, it's, if it's a self-evident truth, then it just means everybody who is basically decent has always recognized that human life is, of infinite value and always worthy of preservation and all this stuff. And we don't even understand, we're inheritors of such a rich and deeply embedded tradition. We don't understand that it's by far not a given to believe and think that. And so, of course, I do believe that, and I do think that, and I am a product of this tradition. But it also, I think, bears remembering that, we're actually not guaranteed that. We didn't just come up with it out of the resources of our own kind of personal virtue and goodness. And there, but for the grace of God, go we into all sorts of other things that we now recognize as, nasty and abhorrent. And then the final part of this that I think is another kind of humbling aspect of studying the ancient texts is that you then start to ask, well, if the people that I think of as nasty and backwards in the past were in fact people trying their hardest to be virtuous and to know the truth, and yet we're totally blind to what now looks like a screaming, deficiency in their moral sensibilities. Where are those in my life? I mean, this is what the Psalm says: "Cleanse me of hidden faults," and that's kind of part of the beginning of wisdom, is to realize that the world being in a tragic state as it is, we are always going to be emerging out of a kind of network of sin. And we may one day, because of our successes or progress today, look back on our present with horror. And we have to kind of accept that, but we also have to extend that grace, I think, to, all the generations of men.